Hi there. Thanks for joining me here on Conversations for Yoga Teachers. I'm your host, Karen Fabian, the founder of Bare Bones Yoga and the creator of the Momentum Magic Method, the way to become a confident teacher, one who effortlessly walks around the room, shares clear cues, easily builds sequences, and speaks from her heart, sharing authentically with her students. On the podcast, you'll hear anatomy lessons, stories from teachers, interviews with others in the field, and a dose of personal growth, because having a strong, healthy mindset is such an important piece of being a confident teacher. In addition to the podcast, follow me on Instagram and TikTok at Bare Bones Yoga for daily videos. And you'll also see a new link on both of my profiles, my Stan Store link, a literal vending machine for you to select how you best want to be supported as a teacher. There, you'll find links to the podcast, free resources, and other ways I can help you be the best teacher you can be. And don't forget, every single week, in addition to recording you a new episode of this show, I also teach yoga classes and free workshops specifically for yoga teachers. The only way to get your invite is to be on my mailing list. You can do that simply by going to my website, barebonesyoga.com, and down at the bottom, entering your email in the box. Here we go with today's show. Hi there. Welcome to Conversations for Yoga Teachers. I'm your host, Karen Fabian, and this is episode 307. I'm recording this on July 25th, 2024. This will go live on July 29th. I don't know about you, but it feels like if you're listening to this in the month of July, it feels like to me, July is just going on and on and on forever and ever and ever. I mean, the 31 days of July just for some reason seem longer. I guess that's why they call it the dog days of summer. Not that I'm complaining. Summer is my favorite season. It's just interesting to me. I thought for sure this particular episode would be going live in August, but no, we're still in July. So if you're following along and listening to episodes as they drop, I hope you're having an amazing summer. I actually went to one of my favorite beaches in Massachusetts, Crane Beach in Newburyport, yesterday. And it was the first time I had been there definitely had not been there since COVID. So what was that, 2020? So maybe I was there in 2019. It's my favorite beach. And I just have a whole list of things I want to do. And that was one of the things on my list. I'm actually hoping I have a chance to go back. It's a huge beach. It's got a lot of protected land. You can hike and see all sorts of protected birds. The beach itself is beautiful. They've really done a great job with making it usable for people. There's a great snack bar and a little cute gift shop. They do a whole bunch of different things like kayaking. And right up the street, there's this darling orchard, and you can get freshly made baked goods and kind of the quintessential New England experience. So if you live in or around Boston and you've never been up to Crane Beach, I would highly recommend it. And certainly if you have plans this summer to visit New England and you're in the North Shore area, go check it out. So what we're going to be covering today is the first thing I wanted to share with you, using this sort of new format that I started a few weeks ago, where we focus first on an anatomy lesson, we then get into a teaching skills conversation, and then a final piece on mindset. So the first piece of this conversation, the anatomy lesson, I want to focus on cueing. And in particular, I want to focus on something that a teacher raised as a question to me. And I thought this was so interesting, and it would make really for good conversation here on the pod. And this teacher actually just enrolled in my program. I had 2 teachers enroll in my program last week. Interestingly, one is in Ireland. I'm, of course, in the States. And the other one is in the United States. I believe she's in Maryland. And I always am amazed by just the global reach of my program. And many teachers enroll after following me on Instagram for a couple of weeks, and they're just in this mindset of, I'm so ready to learn more anatomy and feel more confident when I'm teaching. I really want to be a better teacher. I want to share my cues more clearly, save time building sequences. I want all the things. And they'll follow me on Instagram for some period of time, reach out, and we'll have a conversation, and then they'll enroll. So last week for me was really exciting because I got to enroll 2 new teachers in the program, and then just have the fun of beginning conversations with them in our coaching calls. And it's always interesting for me, as someone who lives in the United States, to speak with a teacher who's teaching outside the US and just find out, what are things like in their area, what are some of the things they're seeing in their classes, and that sort of thing. So one of these 2 teachers that just enrolled had a really interesting question, and it had to do with teaching in a studio where hands-on assists are prohibited. And how do you give corrective cues when you're teaching and you notice students are out of alignment? So I want you to think about, there's one part of this conversation that has to do with assisting, and there's another part of this conversation that has to do with corrective cueing. So let's just first take the assisting part. I'd love to know, number one, from you, if you are doing hands-on assists in your classes. And you can send me a DM on Instagram, Bare Bones Yoga, and let me know. Because I'd like to do a little bit of an informal poll to get a sense of who is assisting out there. When I started teaching 20 years ago, assisting was a normal, regular part of teaching. The interesting thing, though, is we didn't ask anybody for permission. In retrospect, I think that was really a mistake, but it was accepted as part of teaching that assisting was just part of teaching. And now, with everything we know about the effects of trauma, what trauma can look like, the difficulties that people have in speaking up when they've been traumatized in one way or another, there's just such a greater awareness around bodily autonomy, around having agency over one's body and one's, even beyond the physical body, just the personal space that we all have agency over, even when we're in a public place like a yoga class, even when we go to the doctor, right? Where, where we really sort of abdicate in many ways our agency over our own body. And what supersedes that is our interest in receiving medical care. But even in that context, I certainly notice when I go to the doctor, there's a lot more reference to this in subtle ways. The last time I went and had a physical, the nurse asked me if I would like to have my weight taken, because there's a lot more awareness around getting weighed being potentially a triggering thing for people. And there's questions on the intake questionnaire that have to do with, are you safe at home? So, I think in an overall sense, our knowledge and our our awareness of the importance of having bodily autonomy has certainly increased. And rightly so, the assisting modality has now kind of shifted to one where you need a student's permission. And so this particular teacher is teaching someplace where the studio has decided from a policy standpoint to simply rule out assists, and nobody is allowed to assist a student with hands-on. So this heightens the need for teachers to really be clearly cueing, and also from an anatomical corrective cueing standpoint, have a good understanding of how can I take a student who's out of alignment and provide verbal cueing that can allow them to click into better alignment without me going over and maybe slightly touching their knee or slightly touching their hip or that sort of thing. Now, I will certainly say from my own most recent experience, I just picked up a new class on my schedule and just started teaching it 2 weeks ago. And so I am definitely not providing any hands-on assists as the students get to know me better. And so everything I'm going to share with you here, I am doing as well. So the first thing that I want to do is give you a short list of what are the skills and what is not so much the skills, what is the approach? What are the things that you want to be aware of when you are going to give a corrective assist? I'm sorry, a corrective cue in lieu of a hands-on assist. And you can also think of this as this is just a really helpful way to share your cues, regardless of the fact that it's a slight alternative to a hands-on assist. And so the first thing you want to do is when you're looking at the student, and obviously this only works in the context of doing the walk and talk. If you're practicing with your students, this is not available to you because you've decided you want to practice with your students rather than walk around the room. That's a separate conversation. We can get into that. I'm not saying that you shouldn't be doing that. You can do whatever you want. However, when you do the walk and talk, obviously you have more eyes on your students because you're walking around. And so this conversation we're going to have here goes hand in glove with the walk and talk approach because you're walking around, you can see a student who's out of alignment. So I want to give you kind of a frame of reference. Let's say you're looking at a student in triangle pose and you notice they have the right foot forward, the left leg back, and you notice their right hip is sticking out behind them. You want to give them a corrective cue to align, to get them to the point where their torso is aligned over their right leg. And as they reach their arms out wide, I sort of don't love the between two panes of glass metaphor, but they're more aligned, upper body over lower. But you can't put your hands on them. So what do? So the first thing you need to recognize is what is out of alignment. In this case, what we see, and I hope you can visualize this in your mind, is we see a student in triangle with the upper body leaning forward. They're also not using a block. So they have their right hand on their right shin and their upper body is leaning forward. They're looking at the ground. So we want to correct them to get their upper body aligned over their right leg and get the arms out wide so the shoulders are in external rotation. So I've already kind of skipped ahead by using an anatomical term, external rotation. So the first thing is we want to just be in the visual mode of looking at them and noticing just from a shape perspective, what is out of alignment. So in this case, I would identify the upper body falling forward over the lower body and towards the floor. And I would also note the head is falling forward as well. And I would also notice that the right hip is jutting out behind the body. So that's just the conversational phraseology of what I notice with my eyes. That's what I can see. That's what I would describe in non-anatomical terms. Now what I need to do is be able to quickly translate that into anatomical terms. What anatomically is out of alignment? Well, if I look at the right hip is internally rotating instead of externally rotating. So I want to create more external rotation in the right hip. The upper body is falling forward towards the ground rather than having the upper body aligned over the lower leg. So the right hip is in more flexion than external rotation, as we just described. And that's what's causing that upper body to fall towards the floor. Also, there's just the pure alignment issue of the spine is not aligned in it's called axial extension, just one long line of the spine. What this student almost has is a little bit of spinal flexion, like they're hunching over their desk. In this case, they're hunching over their front leg. The other thing that I'm probably seeing with a student in this sort of alignment is I'm probably seeing the upper shoulder internally rotated versus externally rotated. When I cue the student to get the upper body aligned with the lower leg, both of their arms are going to be able to reach out super wide, and that's going to facilitate external rotation in both the left upper and right lower shoulder. So the first thing I need to have is a good understanding of joint movement so that I can identify what are the anatomical misalignments from a joint movement perspective. And then I want to be able to translate that to muscular action. So when I look at the right hip, I'm noticing, as I just said, that there's too much internal rotation. Therefore, the right sitting bone is sticking out behind the person. So that's more internal rotation, which is the job of the tensor fasciae lata and the anterior fibers of the gluteus maximus. and not enough external rotation, which is the job of the piriformis, the quadratus femoris, the obturators, and the gemellis. So that's from a muscular standpoint. And then in my head, I'm going to ask myself, can I cue to those muscles? And in this case, I can't, because most people don't know any of those muscles. They're not just common knowledge muscles. As far as the upper body, I want to get the upper body leaning back so the upper body is aligned more over the lower leg. And then, as we said, I want to create more external rotation in both shoulders. External rotation is the job of the muscles in the posterior shoulder joint, teres minor and infraspinatus. Again, I can't really cue to those because people don't know those muscles. They're not out in regular conversation. So this leaves me with being able to give a corrective cue in lieu of a hands-on assist, or even if I could do a hands-on assist, I would still give these corrective cues. So the first thing I want to do is speak to the position of the right hip. So I want to get the right hip in more external rotation. And so what I could ask the student is bend your front knee and tuck your right sitting bone underneath you and direct it towards your back heel. What that will do is start to create this spiraling effect in the right leg. So the right hip starts to roll, quote unquote, open. So open equals external rotation. So that creates more external rotation in the right hip. The next thing I want to do is place a block behind the right shin to move the student's right hand from in front of the leg to behind the leg. And because their right hand will now be on a block, that will give them more lift away from the floor, therefore getting them out of that spinal flexion and excessive right hip flexion and align the upper body over the lower body. So now they're in better alignment. Now I can speak to external rotation of the shoulders. Take the arms out wide, open through the front line of the body. So I can use more common movement-based cues to kind of top off how the alignment of the pose is. So just note kind of what the algorithm was there, what the, not really algorithm, what the framework was there. I needed to know what the joint actions were. I needed to identify the joint actions that were misaligned. I needed to be able to speak to corrective joint actions and make a decision about, can I speak to joints? Can I speak to muscles? Are the muscles that are concentrically contracting ones that the student will know? Or if not, like in this case, they're not common knowledge muscles, I need to speak to something else. So that's just an example of what this would look like with regard to just this one pose. But I want you to be able to step away now and just look at the framework of what I did. And the framework of how I did it is what I just shared with you. So where does this leave you? So when you're teaching your classes and you notice somebody's out of alignment, first thing to identify is what part of the body is out of alignment. Now, this is a hard question to answer because, of course, everything works in concert with everything else. So we can look at a student holistically in the pose. Let's say a student in chair pose. We can look at the student in chair pose and we can notice that they're sticking their tailbone out too much, hyperextension of the tailbone. And while that part of the body might be where we're looking, when we look at the pose holistically, we might notice they have this really big sway back and their arms aren't straight. So we can look at it from the 10,000-foot view, or we can hone in on one particular thing, like in this case, the hyperextension of the tailbone. And along with that, the anterior tip of the pelvis. The pelvis is tipped forward too much. So we first want to identify what is the biggest issue. In this case of the chair pose example, it'd be the hyperextension of the tail. So then we want to decide, well, what's a corrective cue I can give to that part of the body to start to affect that part of the body, which hopefully will have a ripple effect on everything else. So in this case, so here we are doing a second example. In this case, I can say to this student, draw your belly button in and slightly tuck your tailbone. And with that one cue, they're going to start to posteriorly tip their pelvis just a bit and start to correct that sway back so it's not as exaggerated and get that hyperextension of the tail mitigated enough that they come into better alignment. And then the other thing that's going to happen, because in many cases, when students are in that hyperextended tail position in chair, it's because the lats are too tight. And the latissimus dorsi is a shoulder extensor. But in chair pose, the arms are up in the air, the shoulders are flexed. So the latissimus dorsi is overstretching. It can't do it. It can't allow the arms to be straight because there's not enough extensibility in the muscle. And so as I ask them to draw the belly button in, then slightly tuck the tail, that's going to decrease the emphasis on the lats to stretch. So they will be able to straighten their arms more. So they'll overall, in the aggregate, from the 10,000 foot view, they'll come into better alignment. And I never had to touch them. So let me just add this other piece because, I'm speaking to you, you're listening now, but I have no idea what your understanding of anatomy is. You could be listening to this and the entire conversation could be going over your head. You could be listening to this and you could be getting bits and pieces of it. You could be listening to this and you could completely, fully understand it all. If you're in category 1 or category 2, right? So if you're listening to this and it's completely going over your head, or you're listening to this and you're only getting dribs and drabs of it, I want to speak to you directly right now, because here's the thing. There's your experience of listening to this conversation with respect to how well you understand anatomy. And then there's your perception of your ability to learn anatomy. And I want to speak to the second part first, because many yoga teachers who will listen to this conversation, who are in category 1 or category 2, will go into a mindset, will go into a belief that they have, which is, I can't learn anatomy. This is too confusing. This is too hard. I want to just address that and say that is not true. That is just a belief. Almost every single yoga teacher I work with inside my program has on some level a belief that anatomy is hard to learn. But what they realize is that the missing link for them is what I provide, which is a step-by-step way to learn it. This is something that is not part of a 200-hour training. Every single yoga teacher that goes to a teacher training gets taught anatomy in a different way. And every single yoga teacher that goes to every single training comes out of their training with a different level of understanding about anatomy. What I do is I have one way that I teach it for every single person that goes through my program. And it's a time-tested way that I know works, that I know gets teachers results. And so that's the missing key, right? If you lose the key to your house, you can't get in. If you don't have the key to understanding anatomy, you won't learn it. And if you try to learn it on your own by doing all the things like buying books and taking random courses and watching videos and watching social media, that won't do it because you don't have the step-by-step way. Even my videos, which I'd like to think are really, really high quality, especially with respect to teaching anatomy, you can't learn anatomy just by watching my Instagram. If you could, I would never sell you my program. If it was just about watching my videos, I would just say, watch my videos. But I know my videos don't teach people the anatomy in the way they need to learn it because it's just dribs and drabs. One day I'm talking about this. The next day I'm talking about that. The next day I'm talking about this other topic. The key to learning anatomy is learning just what you need to know in a step-by-step way, right? It's not learning it in dribs and drabs in whatever topics are being thrown out there on social media. That's like throwing spaghetti at the wall. So that's the first thing I wanted to address, this belief that you might have. Now, the other piece is if you're in category 1 or category 2, you're listening to this conversation and you're thinking, oh my God, even if I could get over the belief that anatomy is hard to learn, what would I do? So just stay tuned to the end of this episode because I'm going to help you with the answer to that question. I want you to, before we go on to the next topic, I want you to just appreciate that again, on the podcast here, this is kind of like my social media. I'm going to share topics with you. I'm going to share frameworks with you. I'm going to share skills and skill development with you without having a real back and forth conversation with you because this is just a one-way thing. I am just speaking out into the void, but I know you're here and I know you're listening. But the reality is, If you're at the point right now where you're listening to this and you're like, man, it would be so great to be able to do that, you can do it, right? Even though right now today you may be listening and thinking this is going over my head, you can absolutely do it. I can show you how. So that's part one. Part two of this episode is I want to talk to you just quickly about the teaching skill of sequence building. Because one of the other things I got into a conversation about this week with one of the other teachers who enrolled in my program this week is a sequencing conversation. And similar to anatomy, every yoga teacher that goes to a 200-hour training gets taught sequencing a different way. And I hope you're starting to see the trend here. One of the problems with the way teachers are trained is everybody is learning things differently. That's not on its own a problem, but the problem is the different ways aren't always vetted quality ways that get teachers results. And so sometimes I'll begin to work with a teacher and I'll realize there was very little, there was very little rationale and logic attached to the sequencing building that was provided, training that was provided as part of a 200-hour. So I want to speak with you about just high-level sequencing logic. Now, I can definitely refer you to the link in the Instagram, to the link in my Instagram bio, which is my sequence building template. So you can go to that right now. I know you're on your phone anyway, listening to me. Just go to my Instagram, click the link in my bio, and download the sequence building template. I'm going to walk you through, though, just a couple of quick things about that template and about my process that's on that template and how it's different from a lot of things that you're probably hearing about sequence building. Number one, when you take the time to build a sequence, I highly recommend you use it for many, many months until you can teach it without notes and by walking around the room. This will allow you to check the box and know that you have a high degree of what's called unconscious competence around teaching that sequence. You don't want to change your sequence all the time because you never give your brain an opportunity to learn it. And so that means every time you go into your class, you need to bring notes, you need to practice with your students. Otherwise, you worry that your mind's going to go blank. It's a separate conversation if you're worried that if you teach the same sequence over and over again, your students will get bored. That is just a belief. I'm not going to go into the belief busting right now. We're going to stay just in skill building. So first premise is when I take the time to build a sequence, I'm going to make an agreement with myself that I'm going to teach this same sequence over and over again until I know it cold. And the way that I'm going to know that I know it cold is I don't need to use notes and I don't need to do it with them. Okay? Now, if already you're arguing with me in your mind, you don't have to do any of this. You can do whatever you want. I say this almost every single week. You can teach however you want. If you like using notes, use notes. If you like practicing with your students, practice with your students. I just want you to be honest with yourself about the impact of those approaches. When you practice with your class, much of the time you can't see them. When you practice with your class, you create a dependency between your students and you that they need you to practice. When you bring notes to your class, occasionally you won't be watching the class. When you bring notes to your class, it is a sign that you don't know the sequence. If you knew the sequence, you wouldn't need notes. If you knew the sequence, you wouldn't have to worry about it. It would become something just running in the background. You wouldn't need to devote any significant amount of mental energy to the sequence. And what that means is that now you have much more presence and mental energy to devote to your students. Okay, so you've created this sequence, you've agreed with yourself, you're going to teach it over and over again until you know it cold. The next thing is you're going to create the sequence based upon things you know right now. You're going to say to yourself, I don't need to go to outside resources to be inspired. I already know enough about yoga to create a sequence based on what I know. When you agree to do this, not only is it an amazing, empowering feeling, because you're basically valuing yourself and what you know. It also means it's easier to build that sequence because you don't need to pour through all sorts of notes and apps and drawings and all of that stuff. Now, the first thing I want you to keep in mind is what is the objective of this sequence? And then when you write out the sequence, do the sections of the sequence and do the poses in each section match that objective? If I met you in Starbucks and I asked you about your yoga class and I said, what's it like? What would you say? If you said something like, oh, my class is focused on overall movement, building strength and flexibility, and is great for anybody, regardless of their level of experience with yoga. That's great. So now when I pick the sections of the sequence and the poses for each section, I want to be sure that those poses meet that overall objective. So for instance, it wouldn't make sense for me to do a bunch of double binds. It wouldn't make sense for me to do bird of paradise. It wouldn't make sense for me to do Chapasana, half moon with, sugarcane, because those kinds of poses require tremendous flexibility and a higher level of knowledge about yoga, more experience. Those are kind of outside the standard poses. So again, we want to be sure that the flow of the sequence meets the objective, that there's not a mismatch. It's like if you see an ad on Facebook and the ad has a picture of a woman knitting, and then you click the ad and the ad is for a restaurant, you're going to think, what the heck did the picture of the woman knitting have to do with this actual, when I click the link, I'm being sent to a website that's a Mexican restaurant? Like, doesn't make any sense. Why? What does knitting have to do with Mexican food? Nothing. So we want to be sure that, the description on the website of the studio you're teaching at matches what you're doing. What you say to your students at the beginning of class, here's what we're going to work on today, matches what you offer. It's not really a branding thing, although it sort of is. It's just more about when we just look at it through the lens of you as a teacher creating a sequence. This is part of the skill. This is, I don't actually know who came up with this term. I certainly didn't, but intelligent sequencing. This is what it means to have intelligent sequencing. Everything is flowing and it all rolls up to one overall objective. It's all a match. It's like a story. It's like a symphony. It's like a play. It's all a match. So remember, I'm going to button up this part of the conversation with just a quick reminder. Go to the link in my bio on my Instagram page, Bare Bones Yoga, download the sequence building template. Okay, next thing, last piece of this conversation, mindset lesson. I wanted to wrap this episode up by speaking to a specific aspect of mindset. A lot of times when I get on Instagram, which is my primary social media channel, I am on TikTok and I am on YouTube, but Instagram's my primary space, and I'm on Facebook. But Instagram's my primary platform. And a lot of times when I get on Instagram, I do speak to the problems yoga teachers are having. And this is a fine line because I don't want to only speak to the problems you might be having, because what that tends to draw to me are people who are in problem. They are in a mindset of teaching is hard. They are in a mindset of nothing's worth working. But within that group of yoga teachers, there are teachers who acknowledge that some things might not be working well for them right now. However, they are optimistic about what is possible for them, and they know on some level they can do it. And so this is the difference between focusing on what's possible and focusing on what's not working. And so I want to speak to you just quickly about what is possible for you when you, let's just say, when you fill in your learning gap around anatomy, when you develop better skills around cueing and sequencing. Let's just kind of keep it at that. If you were to simply cover those three bases, anatomy, cueing, and sequencing, just those, right? This is a really short list. I'm going to give you just the highlights of what's available to you. More confidence, feeling like an expert when you teach your classes, being able to share anatomy in your cues, having better confidence around answering student questions, no more worrying that your students will be hurt in your class, being able to create and teach creative sequences, having more repeat students in your classes, having students in your classes that really engage with you after class by asking questions, showing that they are really invested in your class, taking on new classes, having the confidence to seek out opportunities to teach in places that might not even have yoga right now. Like, this is just a short list of the results, the outcomes, what's possible for you just around filling your learning and skill gap around cueing, sequencing, and anatomy. And then there's so many other things, developing your own social media following, creating an online course, writing a book, starting a podcast, adding more classes to your schedule, making more money, leaving your full-time job and moving to teach yoga full-time. The sky is really the limit. I can't know what is in your heart right now as you're listening to this with regard to what is your mission. Only you know that. And what I am here to tell you, because I've been at this for 20 years, if not more, I've stopped counting at this point, 2002. What I can tell you is that the more you are excited about your future as a yoga teacher, the more invested you will be in fixing any problems that you have right now and learning whatever it is you need to learn so that you can live that future that you just thought of, that just maybe came to your mind as I was going through this list of what's possible. And so this is why, when I recently have been telling you on the past handful of episodes, this is really the kind of yoga teacher I'm speaking to. This is really the kind of yoga teacher who is eligible to enroll in my program. And I've honed it down to a really specific kind of teacher, someone who's graduated from a 200-hour training. They've registered with Yoga Alliance as an RYT 200-hour, and they're actively teaching at least one paid class a week. That's a really specific kind of yoga teacher. You listening right now might not be done with your 200-hour. You might not be teaching classes, right? Like, you might be in a different phase, but if you're listening and you fit that eligibility criteria, you are the kind of yoga teacher that I am 100% focused on helping. Now, it doesn't mean that my content isn't also valuable and usable by other people as well. It's just that this last piece of the conversation about possibility, if that really spoke to you and you're eligible for my program, we should talk. All right, so we're going to wrap this up with two things. Number one, if you haven't downloaded my free ebook, go get it. It's some of my best strategies and solutions around cueing, sequencing, anatomy, and mindset. You can get it in the link in my bio on my Instagram page, Bare Bones Yoga. It's right there, free ebook. Number two, I just wrapped up enrollment for my Summer Accelerator program. And so in the month of August, there's no opportunity. Enrollment is closed. However, what is available and what is a really good idea for you to get on if you are interested in enrolling in the fall is getting on the wait list. Getting on the wait list for the Fall Accelerator program. And when I say accelerator, it's a little bit of an accelerated track versus my regular enrollment offer, meaning you will be done faster, sooner, still get the same high level results, and you'll also get an enrollment incentive, meaning a discount to enroll. And it's basically something that I'm going to give you, a discount, as a way to incentivize you to say yes to yourself, rather than hemming and hawing and saying, oh, I'm not really sure that I'm ready for this. If you meet the eligibility criteria and you are excited about your future as a yoga teacher, like to be your future better self as a teacher, I want to incentivize you to say yes to yourself. So here's what you can do. If you want to get on the wait list for the Fall Accelerator program of my Yoga Anatomy Blueprint Learning Program, just send me a DM either this last week of July or in August 2024 with the word waitlist. And that's all I'll say for now. Just do that. I will get in touch with you, find out a little bit more about you. But that's the first step to take. Send me a DM to my Instagram with the word waitlist. Okay, that is it. We are done for today. Thank you so much for listening all the way until the end. Keep up the amazing work, and I'll talk to you on the next episode. Thanks for being here with me today. I hope you enjoyed it. And hey, one more thing. While I don't know you personally, I know what a yoga teacher looks like who's ready to work with me. She's ready to take action. She's looking for someone who has the answers she needs. She knows she's worth the investment. She can't wait to get all her prep time back. And she's excited to make a positive change. If that's you, DM me the words podcast offer to my Instagram, and I will give you a special incentive to work with me inside my signature program. My Instagram handle is Bare Bones Yoga. I can't wait to hear from you.